So we've got the renegades and the men in black, clearly. So this is actually one of those panels that I was really, I mean, I'm excited about all of them. I love all my children the best, but this is actually one of those panels I was most excited for, just for like the quality of the discussion because of the different perspectives that we're going to hear from. Obviously, we just heard a little bit from Elena and what she's working on at Ironfish with her team. It would be great, Gary and Sanjeev, if you could just kind of quickly introduce yourselves, give maybe the 30 seconds to minute on your backgrounds, because I do think the messengers here matter, and kind of the diversity of experiences that we're going to pull from to talk about this challenge of how do we get the balance of privacy and security right, which is ultimately going to dictate, I think, whether we get quality US and European policy when it comes to crypto. So maybe Gary, we'll start with you because you're kind of at the intersection here. And then we'll go all the way to the current man in black over Sanjeev, who I promised I was going to be go easy on. I'll give him a little bit of a hard time, but I think his perspective is a really unique one on the stage. So thank you all for joining us.
Sure, and thank you, Ryan, and thank you to the entire Messari team. This has been a tremendous conference. Before we get into background, can I just share my favorite Web3 quote?
Sure.
So the United States should ensure that safeguards are in place to promote the responsible development of digital assets to protect consumers, investors, and businesses, and to protect privacy and shield against unlawful surveillance, which can lead to human rights abuses. These are not the words of my CEO, Zuko Wilcox, at the Electric Coin Company, but rather President Biden in his executive order of March 2022. And I think it speaks to the powerful public-private partnership that can be achieved in this industry. I'm Gary Weinstein. I'm head of global regulatory relations at Electric Coin Company. I'm a former regulator. We can get into that in a little bit, but wanted to say how privileged I am to be among this panel and, of course, having an opportunity to discuss these issues with not just Elena and Ryan, but Sanjeev Bhasker at the Department of Justice, who is so important to this public-private partnership.
Did you just memorize that whole quote? I think when I quote things, it's usually like 3 to 5 words, but I think that's a good starting point. Sanjeev, can you start reading the Iliad from
Sure.
the original Latin from memory, please?
It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. Thank you again for having me. My name is Sanjeev Bhasker. I'm a United States Digital Currency Counsel with the Department of Justice. I will give the standard disclaimer that I'm not speaking in my official capacity on behalf of the Department of Justice or the Department of Treasury for that matter, but in my personal capacity. Very briefly, we have a digital currency initiative in the Department of Justice that, among other things, prosecuting cases, doing training, encourage policy work, and private-public sector dialogue, including being here today, making sure we're understanding the technology, being in the room where the decisions are made when it comes to zero-knowledge proofs, staking, things of that nature, and then using that information to help really protect the community, have good, solid laws to protect the community, to protect everybody in this room, and then to engage going further into Web3 and so on and so on. So specifically, it is our digital currency initiative with the Department of Justice, and you may have heard of our new national cryptocurrency enforcement team that we've created, all wrapped into one, really to serve the community as we go further into emerging technologies.
Sanjeev, let's start with you, because the perspective that I think you get at a lot of crypto conferences is like rah, it's like us versus the world, it's us versus the incumbents, we can't be regulated out of existence, like we're constantly fighting this uphill battle. And when we do have the opportunity to get folks like yourself on stage that are very knowledgeable about the industry, that understand the pros and cons, but that have a different mandate to make sure that we're protecting people from bad actors and we're kind of upholding the existing laws, and really pursuing bad actors, right? Not just kind of going after the good actors. Can you just start by talking about the process that your team, the Digital Currency Initiative, the process that you have for learning about what's going on in the industry, and then strategizing how you're best going to pursue justice without totally stomping out innovation or having adverse consequences for some of the good actors in the industry that are operating in a gray area just because it's early.
Right, absolutely. And I think that it starts with information. We want to absorb information, learn from the developers, learn from a variety of Web3 programming companies, layer ones, but also be mindful of the laws that we have in effect right now, the Bank Secrecy Act, anti-money laundering provisions, and trying to see where we can have a balance where the companies that are bringing new emerging technology to the United States or are currently in the United States are registering, are abiding by our laws, and allowing us to protect our citizens. Generally, we're looking at this information, processing it, seeing are there security breaches? Are there risks to national security? I know this is a Tornado Cash per se panel. Are there opportunities to protect the community by regulating some of this technology and doing that really with a pure heart for the betterment of the community as a whole, but also walking with humility. We understand this is an emerging technology area. We are still learning. That's why we call upon the private sector to engage with us in the dialogue in a whole of government approach.
Elena, I'm going to skip over Gary, and I'm going to come back to him because I view you as kind of like the bridge in some respects in this conversation. As a builder, your first priority is just like, can we actually tackle this huge challenge and get the team to ship our V1, right, yeah. And get it out the door? But in light of what happened with Tornado Cash, it's got to be in the back of your mind.
Totally. Of course.
How do you build in good faith? Yeah. And also not kind of sleep with one eye open, right? Like how do we get that balance? How do you strike that balance, or kind of what's the approach that you've taken?
Yeah, so we're building Iron Fish to be this privacy layer for all crypto assets. So the reason why I emphasize multi-asset support and bridges is because we want to give every crypto asset the ability to have privacy by transferring it over to Iron Fish. And so when we look at Tornado Cash, someone actually asked me this question of do you agree with the intent of OFAC? And I actually do. I actually do agree with the intent. They're trying to protect the U.S. citizens. I may not agree with exactly the execution of what they've done, but I agree with the intent. And so for Iron Fish, for instance, when we think about Iron Fish, the protocol, it is fully private. There are no backdoor keys that the team is going to have. Every wallet does have a view key. So a regulated entity, for instance, could provide an audit using this view key. And then we're going to be putting a lot of controls on those bridges. So for Tornado Cash, there were no controls for who goes in and out of the protocol. Even when we know that it's a very obviously a malicious person trying to use a protocol, there was no way of stopping that. And so for Iron Fish, we're going to be putting a lot of controls on those bridges to minimize bad activity and to basically make a clear message that Iron Fish is for good actors only.
Gary, are you the least traditional product manager in crypto in some respects, right? Because what Elena's saying is, we have to think about who we're giving these permissions to as we think about bridges. So there is an element where legal and regulatory concerns are baked in at the very base layer, and you're kind of at the front lines of engaging with folks, not just in DC but internationally, on what can be done and kind of where the dividing line should be. You'll read kind of scarier reports from Treasury on anonymity enhancing technologies and cryptocurrencies and how they're a net negative and all this money's being laundered. And you all have to make a philosophical and constitutional argument, but also try to toe the line here to make sure that the baby isn't thrown out with the bathwater. So what does that feedback loop look like? And realistically, where do you think we are right now? Are we behind where we need to be? Is it as scary as I think it is when I read some of these reports? Or are there reasons to be optimistic, and kind of what's the current state of play and where we think we're heading the next 18 months?
So thank you for that question, Ryan. 3 words: privacy is normal. If you think about it, and it's not too controversial an idea, but transparency can actually be a national security threat. And let me bring it back to a basic local example to emphasize my point. If I want to send a digital asset to Elena, it can't be in this modern society that everybody, my neighbors, my friends, my family, my mayor, get to see the details of that transaction, not to mention the North Korean hackers, and study my entire financial state on the blockchain. There must be a way to, in this world that we live in, have transactions be shielded and have our private personal purchases be protected in that way, similar to what President Biden espoused in his executive order. And what we're learning when I have discussions with important regulatory officials worldwide is that they are recognizing that there is this national security risk, and there's a need to protect the privacy of their consumers. Even the notion of holding private keys by government is not the best idea because, and I was an assistant attorney general in New York State prosecuting antitrust international price-fixing conspiracies for many years. And what we learned also is that it's very hard to keep our own servers and databases secure from hackers. They're hacked all the time, and there's malware on them where we don't even today know what the consequences of that malware that's sitting on our servers right now will do to personalized data sometime in the future. So at the Electric Coin Company, we have solved for this. We have developed and created a protocol that allows for shielded transactions on the blockchain. And that is accomplished through zero-knowledge proof cryptography. And it also permits transparent transactions and shielded transactions. Those shielded transactions are confidential. And when you think about how businesses operate today, when businesses purchase resources on the blockchain, it should not be that they have to reveal to their competitors everything they're doing. Coming back again to solid antitrust principles about promoting competition to the benefit of consumers. So at Electric Coin Company, and it's a very large ecosystem with open source protocol development by a very large community that's also independent. A shout out to the Zcash Foundation and the entire Zcash community. But what we do is develop this protocol and zero-knowledge proof cryptography to allow other blockchains and other grand use cases to be realized.
Sanjeev, every new technology is going to have its pros and cons. And sitting in the crypto chair, you're going to say, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Sitting at the DOJ, you want to be able to do your job and not be actively hindered if a cartel is laundering money or proceeds from the Lazarus Group and some of the bridge hacks are going to North Korea's nuclear programs. And so these are like very obvious things, whether it's domestic or kind of international concerns about security and just like upholding the law. How do you get the balance right? Like when you're with your team talking about new technologies, what's the reasonable ask? And how would you recommend teams think about making your life easier so that we can reduce, if the 80-20 split is, we're disagreeing about the 20%. How do we get that 20% down to like 1 or 2%? Is it to implement things like what Elena's team is thinking about? Are these technical changes that need to be made, or is it just better engagement and having more conversations with folks like Gary? What's the right combination so that it's not like a boogeyman type of scenario where we're talking about kind of common goals here, but there are going to be some inherent conflicts on both sides?
Yeah, and I appreciate the question. I think Gary's very articulate, as has been Elena. I think it's both. I think it is definitely better technology, but also engagement between both the public and private sector to explain the technology, what are the benefits, what are the consequences, and we open the dialogue. The SEC's done that with the FinHub, the DOJ is doing that now with their digital currency initiative and through other spectrums. One of the things where we want is good technology in the United States. We encourage that, and my colleagues and I were talking about that earlier, the beauty and the benefit and privilege we have to be here, to have businesses here that are successful here, that could thrive here, but at the same point in time, still protect our citizens and protect the world while we educate each other in this area. So, our team and our department as a whole, we are engaging to learn the technology, to have the discussions, and really to say, where can we upgrade or update something for the software developers, and where do we have to redact things at times where there are difficulties, as Ryan mentioned, with the Lazarus Group or cartels, or even child pornographers that are using encrypted ways to transmit material that none of us want to have happening right now in our community. We welcome the discussion. We wish to engage with it. I've had a great time at this conference, meeting many of you, walking the booths, talking to individuals, learning about your technologies, and really hearing what you're doing and seeing how we can adapt that and make that sustainable here, in not only in the United States, but really internationally.
I know not all this is on DOJ, but it is kind of Treasury policy as well. We already have something called the third-party doctrine.
Right.
That's seeped and arguably been overextended in modern society, especially kind of post 9/11. But third-party doctrine essentially says if you're using a bank, if you're using a credit card, if you're using some centralized intermediary, those are surveillable transactions within certain limits, right? But you don't necessarily have constitutional protections under the third-party doctrine that you would to an unreasonable search and seizure in your home, right? My question is, realistically speaking, most users are going to be using the Coinbases of the world, the Krakens, the payment applications, third-party custodians, because they're not going to trust themselves with a non-negligible amount of money under the equivalent of their digital mattress, right? Why is that not enough? Like, why can't we focus our efforts on those centralized parties and like those institutions and live with a little bit of risk in the decentralized protocol sphere for now, right? Until it actually becomes a problem, because the numbers that we're talking about are very small. Is that the right way to think about this? Or, you know, are you really trying to stomp this out at the root before it can grow?
Right, and let me just, I appreciate the question. Let me just make one clarification. The third-party doctrine generally, colloquially, it's a colloquial phrase, applies to public information that's already placed in the public. For example, blockchain records that are already available. But a specific proprietary company like Coinbase or Binance, we still must serve legal service of process. So just to be clear, we cannot just take records. There must be a court authorizing, whether it be a search warrant for documents or a grand jury authorizing a subpoena. So we are not accessing that information legally without court order or without legal compulsory process, as I articulated. When it comes to the open sharing of information that's put on the internet, that would be the third-party doctrine. But to come back to your question, I think the reality is the discussion continues. We're taking all these things into effect. We're learning the technology. We're moving forth. We want to protect the investor just like we want to protect the company. We've had a situation recently where we charged someone at Coinbase for insider trading, more or less. That's not good. I think everyone would understand that. And of course, everyone is innocent until proven guilty, so let me just say that right now, without speaking specifically on that case. But we want to root out bad issues in technology to make it more sustainable, better, and updatable for everybody in the marketplace. Does that mean we stay away from unhosted wallets? I don't know. I mean, the discussion continues. But again, to be clear, the third-party doctrine is not allowing us to go to Coinbase or Kraken or pick your favorite exchange and just take records. We are still needing to have, and will continue to need, court authority or grand jury authority to do so.
Well, it's not all one direction, right? Those, and I understand this might not necessarily be under the third-party doctrine, but there's still AML reporting requirements for some of these entities. So some of that is actually actively getting pushed. Some of it you have to go through the court to get. The point remains, these centralized services are, I think, for the foreseeable future, going to be the touch points that we can regulate, and it would almost be better to regulate those entities well and allow for a little bit of an error rate in the decentralized protocols, in my opinion, in order for the U.S. to continue to take the lead here, because it'll be easier for you to do your job at scale if there's more activity within our borders and within those U.S. regulated services. I guess that was my the general point here. But Gary, going to you, I think the Zcash has actually thought about this quite a bit in terms of how you've interacted with exchanges, right? So like this concept of like view keys and shielded and unshielded transactions. So you've been working for years now, or the technologists at Zcash have been working for years on getting that balance right so that you could interface with those centralized services but still maintain privacy. What's the general receptivity to that approach when you're actually on the ground in Washington?
Yeah,
and what error rate have you seen as acceptable, or are they saying, absolutely not, we see a problem here, we can see this being potentially a scaled problem if we don't get it under control now?
I've been very encouraged, and we do have someone on the Electric Coin Company team, Paul Brigner, who's our head of policy domestically. I'm responsible for global efforts at ECC, and together we have really found a receptive audience, because I think there's a recognition that we're all coming to realize that we are overexposed on the blockchain. We are leaking data, and we are leaking a lot of personal data, which can impact our security. So what we're thinking about carefully, and the conversations we're having with government officials, whether it's domestically or abroad, is how do we amplify the efforts of these nation states that have very important privacy protections in place already. Think about the United States with Gramm-Leach-Bliley, or Europe with the GDPR. All of these nations really think long and hard about how to protect the privacy interests of their citizens. So I think getting back to your last question, Ryan, which is really critical about the pace and cadence of regulation, and do we allow innovation to take off maybe a little bit more before we rush around to solve problems that might create grander problems in the future? I think we need to very carefully consider our future state jeopardy, because the more information we leak and the more we rush around to solve problems where we're not thinking about where this industry will be in 10 years, the more we are causing future jeopardy for ourselves. And when you have those discussions with regulators and you can convey to them that you are high integrity, that you yourself have been a regulator and think very hard about consumer protection and economic stability, it's a welcome conversation. We're never going to meet 100% eye to eye, but I think we can get there. I think we can solve these very difficult problems. It will require us to sort of project into the future a little bit, though, and see where we want to be, and then map that out with the right fostering of innovation without chasing blockchain to the far corners of the world to individuals who are not high integrity.
I'm going to come to Elena in 1 second. Sanjeev, you were giving me a couple smiles when I was talking, and then again when Gary was talking, almost like the interjecting smile of like, I have something to say. Are you just taking it in, or are you going to respond to part of what I said?
I really appreciate the dialogue. I think Gary he's very articulate. I think I just appreciate it, and I'm smiling in appreciation. and I would love to hear Elena's thoughts as well.
All right. So, Elena, is interoperability with some of these centralized services, like the tail wagging the dog as you develop, number one? And then I have a two-part question here. These policies that we expect to see in the next 18 months, some of these clarifications in terms of what the ground rules are for privacy-preserving tech and things like ZK, is that ultimately going to dictate where you build and where your team builds?
That's a great question. So first I want to say that, I think in crypto in particular, privacy has become a really bad word. But what we're building is actually pretty analogous to what we have in the non-crypto world. And actually your previous question was kind of alluding to that as well. Like in the non-crypto world, if there is a suspicious actor, well, the bank gets subpoenaed and the bank gives the bank statement for the suspicious person. And in the crypto world, regardless if you're dealing with a privacy coin or not a privacy coin, you probably are going to go to a regulated entity like a Coinbase and ask for those records. Most privacy protocols have a view key. Ironfish does, Zcash does, Aztec does, and quite a few others. And so it's pretty analogous to what we have in the non-crypto world. And then your other question about, is the regulatory scene going to dictate where we build? What was interesting about Tornado Cash and kind of scary, and that's why I really want to make sure that we have this open dialogue with the U.S. government, is because it really showed that, even though Tornado Cash is a decentralized protocol, the moment it got sanctioned, it was deplatformed off of GitHub. It was deplatformed off of Discord. Alchemy and Infura stopped supporting it. Some miners stopped accepting those transactions because of the potential fear of violating sanctions. And so it kind of showed that the U.S. has a lot of sway in crypto, way more than I think we'd like to admit. And so, I think like we do have to work together. And from all of our conversations with either, active people in the government or former people in the government, everyone actually has really good intentions on both sides. And I think everyone actually wants to foster innovation, and to a pretty large degree, everyone's actually on board that privacy is important. And so I think like there's definitely a clear path that privacy does not have to come at the cost of compliance. And I think a lot of the protocols are actually building towards that future.
This is Treasury's policy, but DOJ works closely with Treasury when it comes to enforcement. How do you get the balance right? And I know you're not going to speak about any specific case, but can you help people understand the framework that you would go through, like at a meta level? Would you prefer to pursue bad actors and kind of chill adverse types of activity without scaring the hell out of people like me and Elena?
Right. It's difficult to speak again about someone else's portfolio and treasury, but the Office of Foreign Assets Control is an office within the Department of Treasury that operates for a lot of different areas to protect national security in the United States, including, in this case, especially designated nationalists, and trying to really protect the United States and our equities from terrorism, from things of that nature. And so we have an entity that's designated as an especially designated nationalist. There's potential civil fines and sanctions if you associate yourself not just with Tornado Cash, but with terrorists, drug kingpins of the like. And there's potential criminal jail, prison enforcement from the DOJ's angle if you continue to engage in violation of IEPA and similar charges. As a Department of Justice, again, not speaking officially on behalf of the department, we're looking to monitor and see how can we protect the country, whether it be ransomware, which many of us have seen in the Colonial Pipeline, those on the East Coast, ranging all the way up to New York. There was a ransomware incident with the pipeline was shut down for about 3 or 4 days last Memorial Day in 2021 from the dark side ransom group in Russia. We want to preclude that type of cyber warfare, to additional ransomware variants throughout the United States, hospital records being infected. Imagine going to the hospital, no longer being able to access your medical records because the target's holding the records ransom for a certain type of cryptocurrency that's encrypted that we can no longer trace. Now, these are concerns we have as a civilization. As crypto, for better or worse, becomes more and more pervasive, it's part of our economies. And Elena made a great point. All these companies, Discord and Telegram and whatnot, are being able to say, we're no longer going to associate because of our concerns of violating OFAC and IEPA. And we're cognizant of that. We take that responsibility very seriously. But I think the bigger picture here is crypto has become so pervasive in our economy, and there's a lot of positive for it, which is part of the reason we're here to have this dialogue. We also need to make sure, and we rely on the private sector to self-regulate at times, to help us understand how we can protect each other, to register under the Bank Secrecy Act where appropriate if you're operating in the United States. And if you see ransomware, if you're affected by ransomware, to report it, not to hide behind it in the spirit of protecting privacy, because we want to help you too. We want to cure the disease, if you will, more or less. And again, encourage good technology, sustainable technology here in the United States.
So I promised, as part of getting this panel together, that I wasn't going to throw any curveballs.
Okay.
But
Here we go.
I would love it if Sanjeev, if you had any questions for these two and vice versa, if you had any questions for Sanjeev that were kind of burning that you wanted addressed, or some clarification that you thought would be helpful. So maybe finish with 2 questions if you have them, one for Sanjeev and then maybe one for either you or Elena. You can shoot fingers if you both have something that's in the back of your mind. So
Sanjeev, do you want to go first?
I will defer to the court. That would mean you.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
Do you have a question for us?
I'm so sorry. What's that?
Do you have a question for us?
Oh, well, I guess the court has deferred back to me. I guess my question for you would be, do you see an opportunity, and maybe you can encourage our colleagues here, because we actually are all crypto colleagues, right, working together for the betterment of this ecosphere. How can the private sector engage better with the government? Do you have any guidance for that when it comes to just dialogue and sharing information without feeling compromised as if you're sharing your code or sharing secrets? Do you have a zero knowledge proof way, if you will, to share, with, and not necessarily the Department of Justice, but government as a whole, to further advance this conversation as we move forward in technology?
I'm actually going to answer a question with a question, which is, within the government, there are so many different sectors. And so as a crypto company, it's actually kind of confusing. How do you talk to these different government agencies, and which ones should we even talk to? So for instance, before this panel, you said, hey, I'm not from OFAC, I'm not from Treasury, so please don't ask me these questions. I'm from the DOJ. Okay, great. So, in terms of thinking about FinCEN and, Treasury and like the DOJ, how do we as a crypto team open up that dialogue, and how do we approach these different organizations that sometimes don't even talk to each other?
Oh, Gary, go ahead.
I think there's an answer.
All right.
The answer is we set up an ISAC, an Information Sharing and Analysis Center, I set up one of the first 2 ISACs in the United States when I was Chief Privacy Officer and Acting General Counsel at a large financial services company developing products for the unbanked. And what that structure allows for is for the federal government, such as DOJ and IRS, and I worked together with the IRS commissioner and his team to do this, to share information with industry participants. And then those industry participants, through the ISAC, can share information in ways that do not upset antitrust laws. And then states or other, even potentially, I'm not quite sure if other national governments can participate in the ISAC. We'd have to think about that. But setting up that structure will allow us to share information in a protected way, in a legally compliant way, that brings forth this public-private partnership to solve these very complex and difficult issues. I think we should go forward with that immediately.
And let me add this last thought as we wrap up. We are engaging together as a whole government. We are talking together. There's been an executive order on digital assets where a variety of our components, Treasury, Justice, Commerce, have developed reports on emerging technology. So we are having this discussion. We will continue to have it. Whether or not we represent certain departments, which is my precursor statement, we still understand for the greater whole, for the whole of government, we must communicate, and we plan to keep doing that going forward. So thank you, Ryan, for hosting us. Elena and Gary, thank you so much for being here, and we appreciate your time.
Yeah,
Thank you.
and I think, Gary, to your point, we definitely need the concept of like you play tag as a kid. You need some safety.
Yeah.
Because our lawyers are going to be terrified about like going in, okay, are you asking the right questions, or are you basically just setting yourself up for failure, or potentially having a negative conversation that raises the eyebrows of a regulator? Like this concept of having like a sandbox where you can sound things out and actually help inform good policy without getting yourself in trouble, I think is hopefully something that we can get towards in the next couple of years with the folks down in DC, if not kind of internationally. So, Elena, last word?
Yeah, so in the bank kind of industry, if I'm getting my history correctly, so I think 13 banks came together, and there was a Wolfsburg group. Basically, the banks self-regulated, and that was a group that actually set standards for how do we catch money laundering. So I think like what would be great for crypto is for us to self-regulate in that way as well. So I kind of encourage not just privacy projects, but all projects to kind of come together and figure out what are the guidelines that we need to go by to self-regulate. I think that'll actually be extremely encouraging to the government to see that the industry is trying to go towards a better direction in terms of self-regulating and making sure that we're building a tech for good actors. So I highly encourage that.
Here's hoping. So thank you very much, Sanjeev, Gary, Elena. Appreciate you coming. We'll do it again soon.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Great.
Great.
Yeah, sir.
Great job.